Good afternoon, and thank you for joining. I'm Hannah Abdullah. I'm a senior research fellow with the Global Cities Program at CDOP, a think tank for international affairs based in Barcelona. I'm very pleased to moderate this session on decarbonization in the circular city, in which we will explore solutions for lowering energy-related emissions through renewable energy and system integration. Now, with around 75% of Europe's population living in urban areas, cities are really the places where most energy demand and energy-related emissions are generated. But supplying clean, affordable, and renewable energy in Europe's cities still remains a major challenge. This will have to change urgently if the EU is to meet its 55% emission reduction target by 2030 and become climate neutral by 2050. The good news is that cities are not only major consumers and emitters, but also innovation hubs that can potentially drive and accelerate the shift towards more integrated and circular energy systems and actually lead on the Green Deal. In a sense, we can say that cities are the optimal scale for climate experimentation and technological and policy innovation. They are large enough to test and pilot new ideas before modeling solutions, and they're also small enough to discard these at a lesser cost if they are not fully functional. The proposal of the Horizon Europe mission to support and showcase 100 European cities in their systematic transformation towards climate neutrality by 2030 really encapsulates and reinforces this idea of cities as leaders on the Green Deal. Today, we will look at how to create an enabling environment for cities to act as experimentation laboratories that can boost innovative and sustainable energy solutions, especially in the sectors of transport and buildings. Our focus will be on the role of energy system integration, the combination of renewable sources with smart technologies, the investments needed, and incentives for green energy use. These are all complex technical issues, and we are glad to have an excellent panel of experts and policymakers with us today to unpack them. Joining us from the European Commission is Hans van Steen, who is Advisor for Research and Innovation and Energy Efficiency at the Directorate General for Energy, where his work focuses above all on questions around the just transition, energy efficiency, and innovation. Unfortunately, Lasse Olsen, Deputy Mayor of Environment and Energy at Aalborg City Council in northern Denmark, is not able to join us as planned, but in his place we have with us his colleague Lasse Friedman, also member of the City Council's Environment and Energy Committee and chair of the board of the Water Supply Division at Aalborg Utilities. Thank you, Lasse, for joining us and stepping in. It's great to have a local government voice on this panel. Then we have with us Christoph Lynx, who is Policy Director at Orgalim, an international non-profit association that represents Europe's technology industries, and Christoph previously worked in the technology sector himself. And last but not least, we have with us Natalie Samovic, who heads innovation projects at Resilient Group and Enerco Team in the areas of renewable energy and digitalization. Natalie is also chair of the working group on smart grids at the European Technology Innovation Platform for Smart Networks for the Energy Transition, and chair of the working group on energy at IoTI, the Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation. Welcome to you all, and many thanks for taking the time to share your insights and expertise with us. We will kick off the debate with introductory remarks by each of the four speakers, and then we will move on to a more free-flowing conversation, during which we will also take questions from the audience. And on this note, I invite everyone watching to post your comments and questions in the chat box. So let's get started. And Hans, as a representative of the Commission, it would be great if you could kick off the debate and provide some background on the European Green Deal and how cities will be vital for reaching the EU's 2030 and 2050 climate targets.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be represented on this panel this afternoon. I think it's a very good occasion to discuss the role of cities in the energy transition, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting the Commission. I also think it's a very good moment to do this. The energy transition is happening, and there's a lot going on. The COVID crisis in which we still find ourselves has really only underlined the need to take really decisive action to simultaneously tackle the climate crisis and to get the economy back on track, to create jobs and to reinstate growth. As I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, will know, the EU energy agenda these days is very much set by the European Green Deal, published in December 2019. So only really a few months or days before the pandemic really hit Europe. And that is, of course, where we find the overall headline goal of making Europe the first climate neutral continent by the middle of this century. But the Green Deal as a strategy is much, much more than that. It's not only about climate change, it's also about circularity, about biodiversity, and perhaps most importantly of all, it's also about being a growth strategy, getting Europe back on track towards getting the economy back to work. And I think that's really important, and that's why the Green Deal is in fact more important now than it ever was. The energy sector is critically important in this sense. 75% of all EU emissions come from energy, either use or production. So that's another important 75% in addition to the 75% that you just mentioned, Hannah, the share of the population living in cities. But of course, because of all the emissions that are directly related to the energy sector, it's quite clear that the energy sector has to undergo more or less a complete transformation if we are to meet our objectives. The Commission has now moved on to publish the so-called Climate Target Plan last year, which clearly set out a need to speed up our action, increase our ambition both for greenhouse gas emission reductions, but also in terms of renewable energy and energy efficiency. And all of these things, the Commission is now working towards presenting a comprehensive package on the 14th of July. We call it the Fit for 55. That relates to the 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions that are required by 2030 in order to be on a credible track towards climate neutrality by 2050. And that will really be a very, very large package that will cover a lot of different areas. In the energy sector, I think we can, in a very simplified way, say that it basically means that we need to do three things. We need, first of all, to improve energy efficiency across all sectors and in all parts of the value chain. Secondly, we need to speed up the deployment of clean and sustainable energy, in particular renewable energy, throughout all the sectors of economy and at all levels. And thirdly, we will need to create the conditions that will facilitate the smart integration of electricity, heating, transport, and industry. This is what we call energy system integration. And in all of these three areas, I think cities have really a key role to play. Let me perhaps just give you a couple of examples, and I know I don't have much more time, and I think you've already discussed that in earlier sessions in this conference. But of course, we now have the Horizon Europe mission, which aims at creating 100 climate neutral and smart cities by 2030. That, I think, is going to be a very, very important tool for making this happen. And another example is the Smart Cities and Community Initiative, which has been running for quite some time, where we have more than 120 cities involved in Smart Cities and Communities Lighthouse program, which delivered more than 180 demonstrators in the frame of 18 large-scale projects across Europe, and also has a facility for exchanging information between the cities that take place and encourage other cities to take part. These are just two examples of some of the things that we're doing. I'm very happy to come back later on and speak perhaps more in detail about what precisely needs to be done, for example, also in the area of energy system integration. But for now, I'll leave it here. So thank you very much for having me on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, for providing this overview of the Green Deal and also mentioning some of the initiatives that the Commission is now embarking on in cooperation with cities. Lasse, in your work at Aalborg City Council, you are dealing with some of the challenges that Hans has just outlined on the ground. Could you tell us about some of the concrete measures that Aalborg is taking to become more sustainable, especially in the energy sector?
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you for having me at this Future City Conference 2021. I think the overlap of Hans presenting first and then me coming afterward with a local example is a good way. So I will tell you about the decarbonization in a circular city in Aalborg and how we are lowering emissions through renewable energy and system integration. This is the map of our municipality where there is a lot of growth in the area marked with green here, and we try to make some symbiosis between the municipality, the supply sector, university, citizens, and businesses. And we are now owner of our local power plant called in Danish Nordjyllandsværket. It was privatized in the early 2000s from being public owned in the past, but we purchased it back in the municipality in 2016. The plant produces electricity with 383 megawatts and district heating with 420 megajoules per second. It's the main supplier of district heat in our municipality, approximately 55%, with 100,000 households. And we see it as a very highly efficient power plant, but still based on carbon, which we obviously want to change. We bought it, as I said, in 2016 in order to secure a supply of heating after 2028. And we also did it in order to make a transition away from coal energy and be able to replace it with more renewable energy sources. Denmark's government has been very ambitious lately with the Climate Act, where the goal is to cut emissions with 70% by 2030, and the reduction goal is at 50 to 54% by 2025. So it's a very ambitious government we have in Denmark in this regard. Our strategy to become fossil-free heating is phasing out coal by 2028 with different sources, you can say. We want to increase our use of surplus heat, or waste heat, somebody call it, and also introduce a larger storage for heating. We also want to test new technologies, which we do in collaboration with the universities, the business sector, and so on. And we want to have a mix of green technologies, so we don't only focus on one source, but a mix, and thereby create a diversity of technology helping us. And we want the heating production to be smart energy system by 2050. It's not only heating that we are supplying our customers with. We also have a new district heating close to our new hospital, and it's one of the world's most energy efficient and climate friendly cooling system with 80 to 90% of CO2 reduction compared to the air conditioning systems we normally use in the hospitals. We use the artificial lake as the source of cooling out in the eastern part of our city. And it's a partnership between our utility company, our local cement company called Aalborg Portland, and the hospital sector in the region of North Denmark. We are ready to use the district cooling here in October this year. And there are many more companies now interested in getting this supply of district cooling, which we know will be a higher demand in the future. This is a drawing of how it works, where you can see pump it up from the artificial lake and then deliver it out to the hospital. So our utility company in 2021 is based on coal, surplus heat, and waste. Those are the three main sources. We are cheap district heating, but we also have this area here on the screen where we are planning future projects. And these future projects will be finished by 2030, where we want to be the green test center of Denmark, where we, together with the university researchers and also business sector, develop the future green technologies by offering also our infrastructure to make new tests and also demonstration. So our hope is that the area we bought in 2016 will hopefully bring a more green Aalborg and obviously also a more green world. So that was my 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
These insights into Aalborg's sustainability strategy and some of the projects that you're working on currently and that you're planning to move into in the future. Especially, I found interesting the new public-private partnerships that you're forming to bring these projects off the ground. Well, looking at the slides you've just shown, it becomes very evident that technological innovation will be essential for these transformations to happen in Aalborg and in cities around Europe. Christoph, you represent tech providers who are working on developing the technology that will enable the energy transformation to happen. Can you tell us why cities are, in a sense, the perfect scale for testing these new technologies, and perhaps more concretely, also what technologies will be rolled out in sectors such as urban transport and buildings in the coming years, and how will these help unlock cities' potential to implement climate and energy goals?
Yes, thank you, Hannah. So those are already a lot of questions. So let me try to answer some of them. So first of all, yes, I represent Orglim, Europe's technology industries. And as you said yourself, we are looking at, so we're the providers of a lot of the technology that either other industry players will use to reach their goals, or that are being deployed at city level or at consumer level. So why are cities so interesting for us? It's exactly because of what you said, because we look at it also as the microcosm of kind of the broader global challenges that we're having around climate change, right? And that is why you will see a lot of cooperation also between the companies that we represent and a lot of cities across the world, because really of that the ability to test a lot of these technologies. Now, when we talk about technologies, there's a wide range of technology, right? If you talk about waste management, you talk about, the pumps, heat pumps, boilers, storage solutions, demand-side technologies like smart metering, like smart homes, even, lighting and automation there. So it's that broad scope of technologies that, again, our companies are providing, or at least helping other companies to provide. Now, where in the past you could say these are kind of like the typical hardware technologies, increasingly, of course, the added value becomes with adding the digital side to it, right? And overlaying digital. Now, we talk about digital technology. I think the program also talks about that. I think increasingly and hopefully in the future, we'll not talk about digital technologies, but we'll just talk about technologies, because digital is going to be just a by default component of these technologies. Now, if you look at all these technologies also, and I think Lasse also mentioned that in Aalborg with regards to the mix of technologies that they're looking at, let me just highlight a couple of challenges that maybe we'll set up a bit for discussion that we see. And I kind of want to use a triangle to kind of highlight that. So there's 3 points there. One, it's the technology, right? We have a lot of technologies in Europe. I think actually Europe is a leader in a lot of these technologies, but we can, of course, not sit still. And so that's where the innovation part comes in. And we need to continuously innovate. And that's why Horizon Europe will also be very important. But bringing it back to the cities level, I think, again, cities are going to be the really nice microcosm for testing a lot of these technologies and continue to innovate. So the call to action to local authorities is to really focus on that and enable that. The second part, or the second point of the triangle, is the deployment side. There are still some issues with technologies being deployed across the market, and a couple of let's say, reasons why, and we can talk about that later. Cost, right? So, for example, for not so mature technologies yet, cost will be high, but sometimes also mature technologies, and that can become because of raw material shortages, etc. So the cost is hampering sometimes the rollout of technologies. Infrastructure as such, we need a more smart infrastructure. And again, digital will play a role in that. But as long as we're not taking that next step and making it more smart, it will also hold up a lot of other technologies that would run on top of that. So that's a second kind of deployment issue. The third one is interoperability. And this is partially also an industry responsibility, right? Where you need to make all of these technologies work together. And especially if you look at the local level, which is within our houses, there's still some challenges with different technologies and different providers. And how can they talk to each other? And how do you make it as easy as possible for a citizen, for a consumer, to make sure that all of these technologies will come together? And I have a very personal example on that. But again, maybe later we can come to that. And then maybe again to local authorities, what is holding back deployment also is sometimes permitting, right? It's the processes. It just takes a lot of time, and it just puts this, let's say, blockage a bit towards the deployment. So that's something that definitely is a call to action at the local level. Where possible, let's try to reduce the permitting, but that's not just one example of administrative processes. So that's the second part of the triangle, the deployment. And then finally, it's the demand side. And of course, it's chicken and the egg, right? So you need to have a big demand for the technologies to kind of maybe the cost will to come down. So how do you stimulate demand side is going to be also an important question for authorities, especially also at the local level. So availability, deployment, and demand side, if we can make that work, I think definitely also at the local level, we will take a big step in rolling out these technologies. To close off, as I said, technologies are there. We will need to continue to innovate, but it cannot just be done by technology. And so that's why I'm coming back to the role of legislation. So as Orglim, we've also supported the climate goals for 2050 and the targets that are being set. And now, of course, we're looking forward to the July 14 package at the European level, the Fit for 55 package, as was just outlined, because there's a couple of things there that we think are crucial. Increase of renewable energy, demand side flexibility, overall energy system integration. I think if you look at those and we get that right, we will make a big leap. And so I'm sure we'll come back to the discussion about Fit for 55. But what I finally want to close with is, when you look at that, that's of course at the European level, and that will take a little bit of time to play out in the legislative process. In the meantime, the call to action is for cities to not wait for that, obviously. A lot of these things, they can already put in motion and stimulate. And that should not be necessarily only via administrative process improvements or by kind of looking at some other legislative initiative they could take at the local level, but also looking at stimulating local initiatives. Right? So we see energy communities popping up, self-consumption. And so as an industry, we're very interested in working with cities, kind of coming full circle, to help them with projects, because the cities are we believe, the right test bed also for starting with some of these technologies and innovate. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm sure I touched on a couple of points that hopefully we can come back to in a moment.
Thank you, Christoph. Yeah, I'm sure we can come back to many of the points you've raised, and thank you especially for also raising the need for legislative changes and also mentioning the Fit for 55 package. I now want to move on to our last speaker, Natalie. We all know that technological innovation, which Christoph has just talked about, will have to be accompanied also by a shift from our current centralized energy architecture towards a more decentralized, flexible, smart, circular, and integrated energy system of grid services and distributed generation in which consumers are also producers. Natalie, you've extensive experience in leading R&I projects that drive this shift. Could you tell us more about the work that you're doing with cities, especially on how to link the digital and renewable energy transitions?
try. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It's excellent timing, I think, for this dialogue. Not only an excellent timing, but also a very good setting. And in my presentation, what I would like to focus on beyond our core activities related to the renewable hydrogen and large-scale solar production and related digitalization, I just would like to illustrate very quickly based on some of the work that's been done at TIPSNet as to how complex and what are the major trends, and as well as what are the major challenges in relation to energy and smart cities. So some of the trends, I think you see my presentation on the screen. This is, I think, a very good illustration that was put together already a couple of years ago by the colleagues at TIPSNet to showcase the Vision 2050. Without setting the overall goal or the direction, it's very difficult to set the intermediate steps. And although the targets luckily are increasing, as was already mentioned by Hans, nevertheless, having the full picture in mind and in sight with all of the components is, I think, is a very important thing. So here you see some of the trends related to the massive electrification. But when we are talking about massive electrification, it doesn't happen only in one place. It happens in various components linked to the cities, near the cities within the regions, and within other massive infrastructures linked to the cities, such as ports, as you can see over here. The second trend that is taking place is proliferation, or the start of the renewable hydrogen, both production and the markets. This is a new trend based on the smart sector integration policy and the European hydrogen policies, which didn't catch us quite by surprise, but it's an additional vector and additional complexity that I think cities will have to deal with and address. Another trend that I would like to mention is the smart sector integration. Here is the slide. We probably can go to the next one. Thank you. Here you see where the circularity takes place, and there is a zoom in on a number of components that form this circularity in support to the smart cities. But the smart sector integration not only deals with the green hydrogen interfaces, but also other interfaces with water production and the use of water in the water production, use of electricity in water production, heat and cooling, mobility, smart buildings, and other components. We can go to the next slide. Yes, and what cannot be forgotten is for this decentralized, very complex, with a lot of interfaces approach, where the cities, of course, play a key role, a very important factor is engagement of the consumer, because without the consumer, the supporting models, such as flexibility of demand and demand response models that we will all need for this massive electrification and introduction of the renewables into the grids. The engagement without the engagement of the consumer, we won't be able to roll out these models, these solutions, and that means that the decarbonization of the electricity and the networks either will be costlier or take longer. So the engagement of the consumer is a very important factor. And here, of course, the cities have to play a very important role for this engagement. We can go to the next slide. Yes, and this engagement also will have to take place on many levels and within many interfaces. Some of them were mentioned by Christoph, I think. So you can see here peer-to-peer energy trading, self-consumption, and as well as the digitalization in buildings or smart homes. Next slide. The other trend that is taking place where the cities play an important role is digitalization, which also was mentioned, but it is for the first time, I think, in the models in our vision, beyond research and innovation, where we can see that all networks are being taken into account: electricity, heating and cooling, gas as an intermediate, and data. So data is both a challenge and as well as the future opportunity. And together with the connectivity, new infrastructures, new services and business models, and the evolving data spaces, it's going to play an important role as well. I think I'm out of time for now, so I probably should stop here and leave the rest of the topics for future discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, for sharing these very nice slides with us, which I think showed very well the complex interlinkages between different energy sources, their use and reuse, providers, etc. Given that sort of a major theme of this panel is system integration, and I think we just saw that very clearly on the images that Natalie showed, I would like to dig a little bit deeper into some of the plans that have been launched by the Commission on this, and specifically the new strategy for energy system integration that was adopted almost a year ago now. And Hans, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how cities will play a role in reaching the goals set out in the strategy, and specifically the main three pillars of the strategy. Firstly, the transition towards a more circular energy system. Secondly, towards greater direct electrification. And thirdly, towards the promotion of clean fuels.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. And I think, energy system integration came up, I think, practically in all the interventions by the panelists. So clearly it is a very, very important topic. And that was also why the Commission took that up, because I think we realized that it was really necessary to start a process of thinking on this, because it's very, very clear that once we have an energy system which is based on a completely different system from what we know today. First of all, much more decentralized, much more based on renewables. You need to stop thinking in silos, both within the energy sector. So you can't think of electricity and heating and the energy. You need to look in the same way.
It seems Hans is breaking up. At least I cannot hear him. Can the other speakers hear him? No, okay.
Can you hear me, or is it?
Yes, now we can hear you. Now you're back. Great.
Okay, so I think I somehow got cut in mid-flight somewhere. But I mean, basically, I was trying to explain that we need to stop looking at the different parts of our energy system in isolation. The silo thinking, as we call it, has got to stop. And we also need to think about the energy sector in much closer conjunction with other parts of our economy, industry, transport, agriculture, maybe not so relevant for the discussion here today, but still. and no longer think about energy in isolation. And that was really the thinking behind the energy system integration strategy that we came out with. And why do we think that cities are so important in this context? Well, it is exactly because within the city, all these things come together, and we're facing exactly the same challenges in all these areas towards a transition towards more sustainable, more, shall we say, livable, and a greener and cleaner way of handling these things. So the city is a perfect place to perform energy system integration. And many people talked about, for example, district heating. And I think heating is an area where we're facing particular challenges. For the moment, heating is almost 80% fossil fuel based, if we look at the EU as a whole. And of course, this has got to change, because we know by the middle of this century, there can be very, very little, if any, fossil fuel left in the system. So we need to think about how can we do that. And that we can only do by moving away from the system we have today, where many people rely on individual gas-fired systems or even oil-fired systems. And we need to have much more collective systems. I think some of the district heating examples that was mentioned by Lasse are really very good examples of how you can then move into a system whereby much more renewables can come across into the heating sector as well. Transport, I think, is another area, because as we move towards much more electro-mobility, the electricity sector and the way in which we organize ourselves there and the future transport fuels will become much, much more integrated. Hydrogen was mentioned by a number of people. There will be sectors of our economy which cannot be electrified, although for the energy transition we do rely a lot on electrification. But there will be certain areas where we will still need different types of fuels, and renewable hydrogen, and I really stress renewable hydrogen, is, I think, one solution that we need to go for there. And that's why, together with the energy system integration strategy, we came out with our hydrogen strategy, so that these two things really have to be seen in very, very close conjunction. Also, circularity aspects, as you mentioned, Hannah, are very important in our energy integration, because we see opportunities for much more circularity, use of waste stream in our energy system. Waste heat in particular, for example.
Okay, Hans is Hans, you're breaking up again. You're breaking up again, so we'll maybe move to the next speaker, and then we can come back to you once your connection is restored. Christoph, I'd like to move to you next, and maybe talk a little bit about the perspective of technology providers on some of the things that Hans has just raised, and some of the challenges that are also tied to moving beyond silos and integrating economic sectors and different energy sources. From the perspective of technology, what are sort of the big challenges in helping cities do this?
Yeah, I did mention, like in my introduction, a couple of the, remember the three challenges. So at a high level, so availability, deployment, demand side. But let me zoom in on, I think, what Hans was mentioning also with regards to, if you look at the city level and you take, for example, in general, you have two big sectors that with regards to energy consumption, and it's buildings, right? And it's transport. And if you look at the city level and you would put that together, I think, for example, when you talk about charging infrastructure and at the same time you look at the goals of renovating the buildings, so how do you bring, for example, the car also towards the house? And you have, of course, vehicle to grid discussions, but in the home. So I think that's exactly the areas that you see where you risk still working a lot of silos, right? So you have the transport sector, you have the building sector, and of course, that needs to come together. And I think at the city level, that's so visible. I'll give you my personal example on this, right? And this goes to my point also about administrative hurdles. So I live in Brussels, right? So I have a house here in Brussels, row house. I have a small garage, which is stacked with a couple of bikes. And I want to buy an electric vehicle, right? But according to the region here, you cannot ask for a charging point in front of your house if you have a garage. Now, the problem is my garage is not big enough. So this is just like one stupid, simple example about where the rules say, no, you'll have to go 5 blocks further to charge your electric vehicle. You don't have the right to ask for a public charging point. It's just kind of this combination of house, where you live with the infrastructure. And then smack in the middle, of course, are the local governments that need to try to find the right balance. So that's just for me one example of where, to Hans's point, you really need to break the silos, and that's why we're so supportive of smart kind of the energy sector integration. But of course, now it needs to be followed. That was a strategy, right? It needs to be translated into action at the European level, but also at the national, regional, and local level. So that's kind of where, of course, we need to move faster, I think.
Thanks, Christoph. And maybe we can actually circle back to Lasse now, who works for a local government and who's probably faced with some of these challenges. Lasse, maybe you can pick up on some of the things that Christoph has just mentioned. How does the municipality of Aalborg navigate the sort of tensions between changes in demand and use, and on the other hand, existing legislation, perhaps even at the national level? How do you deal with this at the municipality in Aalborg?
So what we do is we try to do as much partnership as possible, and also sector linking. An example on that is the sector linking is that we're owner of the water utility company, and it's now a multi-utility company we have with energy, heating, and so on, water as well. And we found out that our wastewater actually have a high temperature. So we are now using a heating pump on our wastewater and using that for the heating we send out. And then afterwards, the wastewater is also used for biogas. So the whole circle of thinking of resources is what we try to do. But I would say that our biggest strength and what we try to work on mostly is the partnership and going between sectors, not only looking at the municipality, but also looking at the private sector, the transportation, as Christopher mentioned, and also Hans, and do partnerships. And we're not only looking at our own municipality, but also on the neighboring municipality in our whole region. So we are now making a strategic energy planning of our whole region together. So we don't do a district cooling heating with neighboring municipalities, but we try to do it in an efficient planning way. So we could easily use the cooling district heating, the district cooling for the neighboring municipalities instead of only using for ourselves. So this is, I would say that the whole thing is planning and partnership, in my opinion.
Great, thanks. And you already gave us also some examples of the partnerships that you've created in your earlier presentation. Thanks for that. Natalie, you really are the expert on this panel on how digital technologies and Internet of Things can enable the sort of more integrated energy systems that we're looking for. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how Internet of Things enabled models can boost the twin digital and renewable energy transition in cities?
Yes, Hannah. I would also like to use an example of the informal partnerships that are taking place in order to address these multifaceted challenges. So one of the examples that we've done last month, so it's very recent, but the topic is very important, related to the electric vehicle charging. So together with NSOE, transmission system operators, AOTI, we have about 190 members within the alliance, and with BEUC, which is consumer representative of the consumer rights organization in Europe, organized a workshop with the titles "Electric Vehicle Charging Only a Building Block or a Game Changer for Energy Transition?" And the topics related to both the challenges to the grid operators that are being posed by the massive electrification and introduction of the electric vehicles, and as well as the new models related to the electric vehicles introductions, such as V2G, vehicle to grid, where the vehicle could be used as the energy storage component to provide the flexibility to the grid, and as well as potentially services to the building if it is located in the building. But this approach to address a number of challenges. Some of them was mentioned as to the what type of infrastructures are needed. So Christoph mentioned public infrastructures by the city, but there are also public-private infrastructures within the shopping centers, for example. That's another model, another taxonomy that is evolving. Then public networks that could be rolled out within the cities. So this taxonomy approach is very complex, and we're starting to address it. Why is it important? It's because infrastructure is just one component, but behind that infrastructure, there is integration into the grid. There are connectivity networks, so that's the data that is there, and the rules and the governance as to how do we share data between all the players, as well as the technology providers, and as well as the electric vehicles, the car manufacturers in there. So this workshop and the topics that we were discussing, including agile policy approach or agile regulation that is needed to address all of the components, is one of the examples. So we are really putting it as the head start and not as fixing problems later on, but approaching from this wide communities and decision makers and the contributors from the get-go, one of the examples.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you also for raising the issue of data and how data technology can help us to rethink urban transport and also other urban systems. I would like to remind the audience that you're more than welcome to post questions in the chat, which we will be moving on to now. We have a question from Lindsay Hendricks from Deloitte in Latvia. She's asking, how can it be ensured that regions in Europe producing significant energy from renewable sources are connected to regions where appropriate storage is available? Maybe a question for Hans. Hello, Hans, can you hear me? Would you like to take this question? No.
His screen is frozen, probably.
I think he can't hear me. Would anyone else like to jump in?
Maybe
yeah, Natalie, feel free, yes.
So as has been evolving within the past 10 years. There's various plans on which regions in Europe would be producing what type of renewable electricity. So we know we have wind, offshore wind in the north, areas rich with wind potential, solar, or a combination or hybridization of those. Then we also have the policy on the interconnection and reaching the targets of the interconnection between the regions. And for the grid network, the regions are not the same as the geographical regions. So the network has different typology, but it's all interlinked. But the fact that that, let's say, Iberia is going to be producing more renewables from solar, the storage of those renewables not necessarily has to migrate somewhere. We see the evolving clusters, so-called hydrogen valleys, for example. So it doesn't mean that we have to transport in the same form of renewable generation, but we can transport in the form of green hydrogen, for example. And the topic of the seasonal storage is also very much on the forefront, but it won't be one solution for all the regions. Seasonal type of storage will also vary depending north, south, east, west, center. What we shouldn't also forget is the power of the distributed storage. So we already mentioned vehicle to grid, but also the smart homes storage, or even industrial scale, where there is quite a bit of the consumption. So various models are evolving. Lots of research and innovation projects were conducted in this field, and also I think the European industrial strategy for batteries is bearing the fruit. So lots to look forward to.
Thank you, Natalie. We have another question for Christoph. What demands will future smart energy and utilities infrastructure place on existing infrastructure, and what preparations are required to ensure grid stability and cybersecurity? Christoph, any thoughts on this question from the audience?
Yeah, so it's clear that I think I said it earlier with regards to the current grid, right? Investments will need to be made to make it actually smarter, right? And what does smarter mean? I think there's a couple of elements to that will then also help with, let's say, the increase in energy demand in the future. Smart means also that you have a better insight in your networks, right? Which also means better predictability, right? So with regards to the energy creation, production that's coming in, at what time, the expectations. It's also about the load shifting, right? So it's the ability to kind of shift the loads. So I think it's the combination. So if you want to make your grid smart, there's a couple of things you need to do and invest. Clearly, that will require some investment. But it will then also allow it to kind of handle these new kind of energy creations and also the demands. Now, on the point about cybersecurity, it's a really important point, of course. And currently, when some of our members are also providing the technologies that go into transmission and distribution, right? And I can tell you that when it comes to cybersecurity, there is already a very big focus on that. So it's not that, of course, that is new, but it's true. And I guess that's what the question is implying also. Even as you move forward in making that grid even smarter, the risks will also increase, right? So, but it's not that we're starting from zero. And it's not just about the grid. It is about all of the things that will be connecting into the grid. We talked about electric vehicles, the charging infrastructure. So cybersecurity will be a quick core element. And I know the Commission, also member states, are closely looking into what other steps need to be taken. There is actually a discussion currently ongoing. It's called the Network Information Security Directive, NIS, which also links it to that. So it's not just about the grid. It's about how to increase cybersecurity of everything that will be connecting to the grid. And that's not a small feat. It's not a small task. So there's still a lot of work ahead. But also, we're not starting from zero. I just want to underscore that part.
Thanks, Christoph. So as we can hear from Christoph's answer, these are highly complex issues that even touch on security. And I would like to dive a little bit deeper on the investment issue that you've mentioned and the need for investments. And maybe Lasse, you could come in on this. As someone working for a local government, what would you like to be done at national and EU level to promote incentives for green energy investments in cities?
So it's all about speed, isn't it? You know, how quick do you want the transition to be done? And the quicker the transition needs to be done, in our case, get rid of all the fossil fuels, the more investment it requires. And we are in dialogue with the Ministry right now of Climate in Denmark in order to maybe support the transition to be even faster than 2028. And we are now talking 2025. Let's see how the negotiation goes with the Ministry. But it's clear for us in the local government that the more rapid transition also requires external investments and also external partnerships. And I'll just mention that I'm part of ICLE, the local government's climate, and we bring up different ideas through this network. And we also do project applications together, smart city application as an example for the European Commission funds and different funding opportunities. So there are a lot of funding opportunities out there, but I think the whole question is to create the foundation locally and find the right partners when you do an application to get the funding. But in Denmark, we are hoping that the government will do their part in the transition.
Thank you. Hans, it's good to have you back. We're talking about how national governments and also the EU can stimulate technological investment in the green transition in cities and technologies. Maybe you also want to come in here and say how the EU is working on this.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the connection issues. I'm now in a different room. I hope it works slightly better. I think it is actually a very important point because it is very clear that the investments that we need in these areas are absolutely enormous, and the more you can stimulate these, both at European level and at national level and local level, the better. Now, with the recovery and resilience package that the EU is making available from the recovery from the COVID crisis, there's already a very, very good start. And I think a lot of this should be used to finance, for example, things like building renovation, but also infrastructure at city level. District heating, I think, is a very good example of something that could come into that. And we're very happy to see, when we've been looking at the plans that the member states have submitted, that there are a lot of very good ideas out there, and overall the proportion of projects that are being proposed in the recovery and resilience plans to do with energy is very high. So that is, I think, very good. Let me say one thing, though, and I think this is maybe a risky comment, especially with Christoph and also with Natalie on the call, because they are very much into technology and new technology as well. But there is a lot of things that we can do also on the basis of things that are already available today. That there's not, so we say, we don't rely on new technologies for lots of things. A lot of renewable energy technologies have reached the level of maturity. The costs have come down tremendously. Just think about things like solar PV, which in many cases is now actually cost competitive. And these are things that we can just go ahead and do. There we are thinking much more about breaking down the barriers that exist for these things actually to happen. The example that Christoph gave just before I was disconnected about his charging point for his electric car is a very good example. We're trying to deal with that. Also, we will be revising the energy performance of buildings directive later on. Hopefully there we can come back to some of the things that we didn't get when we adopted the latest version of that directive to do with charging point in public buildings. But these are the kind of things that will actually help people make the right kind of investment decisions and basically make sure that people see that these are things that are not necessarily difficult to do, but simply can be done without too much hassle on a daily basis. So I think there's a lot that can be done on the basis of technology that is already available today.
Thanks, Hans. Maybe we can now talk about users and consumers a little bit, which is a topic that we have only touched on very briefly. And Natalie, this is also something you've worked on quite a bit. And one of the advantages of these more decentralized energy systems that we've seen in your illustrations is really that they empower consumers, or what some call prosumers. How can we incentivize green energy use, and how can we incentivize the participation in these more decentralized energy systems?
Yes, Hannah, this is important on two levels, as I mentioned. It's important for the overall system and what we can accomplish. When I say system, it's electricity networks, and also speed with which we can accomplish and meet the goals. And let me add another maybe controversial comment to what Hans mentioned here. Scaling up of what we currently have is one of the biggest challenges. So we're working on the interoperable digital platforms, on the hyper-connected sensor networks, on the new architectures and data models that transverse from the industrial production into the energy field. These are all great things that we will need for this, the hockey stick speed up and scale up, but at the same time, we need something that can be done year over year. And here the comment is as follows: the public sector leadership is very much needed. So I would personally like to see most of the municipal buildings or the municipal facilities, such as public schools, such as municipalities, other facilities, walking the talk in the first place, facilitating contracting of renewable electricity in the first place. So there is no excuse for the public sector not to use that. I think the Commission itself is doing a great effort in that. I think they've appointed the Chief of Sustainability very recently. So I think that's one of the efforts. So the public sector leadership for the renewable sourcing, for the digitalization in the facilities, for the energy efficiency topics, for the electric mobility. And I think because municipalities are or the cities are the closest to the citizens, right? So leading by examples, and not only one example, but in many sectors, transport, buildings, also smart systems, or even supporting some of the new business models, or even stacking of services towards the grid. I think it's a very important first step. There's more, but I'll stop here.
Thank you. Christoph, maybe you'd also like to come in on this or respond to Hans's comment earlier on.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I agree with Hans. So in that, it's not about technology for technology's sake, right? It is a lot about also existing technologies and trying to get them ramped up. And this is what I was trying to refer to when I said one of the challenges with technologies is kind of the second part was the deployment side, right? It's identifying what's holding back deployment of current mature technologies also. So I completely agree. It's not, so we need to have that mix, right? But the point that I was also trying to make is we cannot sit still, right? And I think Europe is strong in trying to innovate and find new, let's say, technological solutions. So the innovative part still needs to be there. And the last thing I wanted to comment on was on the The third point I mentioned, the demand side, right? And this relates to what Hans was saying and Nathalie. I wasn't looking purely also from a consumer citizen perspective, but definitely the government plays an important role in the demand side. So if you look at public procurement and how that can drive a lot of the uptake, it's crucial. And I think with the RRF, so with the Recovery Resilience program, I haven't seen all of them, right? So my hope is really, we were really pushing for the Commission also to keep pushing to stick to the, let's say, the percentages that were set forward on digital and the green objectives, because that will really drive, I think that will be a big shift in what we've seen over the last couple of years. So once that gets injected, I do believe we have a great opportunity. So, but public sector will also need to lead in that regard a lot. Together with the private sector, but so I think definitely public procurement will be important too.
Thank you, Christoph. And maybe building on the last point you made about public procurement, I'm wondering whether Hans would maybe like to talk about his view on what the role of government, and here talking local, national, but also EU level, is in stimulating technological innovation for the green and energy transitions. The Recovery and Resilience Fund will do this, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about the how.
First of all, I absolutely agree with what both Nathalie and Christoph said just now about the public sector. Really, really important. And in fact, one of the things that we are trying to do now is to strengthen the, so we say, part of the Energy Efficiency Directive that will be coming out on the 14th of July, and to have clearer obligations on the public sector to make sure that the public sector plays what we call an exemplary role. I think it's so important for ordinary citizens, when they see how the public sector is behaving, that this leads the way by example. I mean, for example, when the postman comes, or if it's not a public post service, and if other public services come to you, they come in an electric car. When you go to your school or your hospital, you see that you're not in a building that is leaking energy right, left, and center. All these things are really, really important, and I think that is absolutely essential that we get this right. I think this is probably also a comment to Lasse, working for a public authority, that I think it is important that this is not seen as something that the public sector is just imposing on the citizens without doing its own part of the work. And I think, for example, now with the recovery and the resilience plans, there is actually a very good opportunity and moment for the public sector to do a lot of these things. Now, on your question, Hannah, how to do it, and that is, of course, always the more difficult part of the equation. But I think, the first thing is awareness. We need to make sure that there is information out there about the opportunities, and I think it is helping a lot already today. And there's a lot of thinking that this is very, very difficult. And of course, energy efficiency, for example, is difficult because it's very often tedious, and you need to evacuate the building while you renovate it or whatever. But it is doable. But it has got to be examples of how things are done, so that people see that it is possible to do it. I would say that is really the starting point, that the information is available, that this is going on. And then I think there has to be some hard obligations as well, requirements, whether these are in the type of targets or other ways of making sure that there is some way of accountability for example, public authorities, to say that a certain amount of floor space has to be renovated up to a certain standard. That could be a requirement, that could be set at a European level. It could also be left to subsidiarity, and member states and could deal with it. But at the end of the day, probably that will be necessary. You cannot only have carrots. There has to be also some sticks, and some legislation sets that sets these requirements so that it's clear what we need to do. And once you start to look at what it is that we need to do, it is absolutely dramatic. For example, on energy efficiency, if we are to be climate neutral by 2050, and it's not really an if, because this is what we have all agreed, and member states have agreed to this as well. If we look at what this means in terms of our energy use, it actually means that we need to halve the amount of energy which is being used today. So it's not just about improving energy efficiency and deal with energy intensity and so on. It's actually about dramatically reducing the amount of energy that we use. And if we don't do that, we will simply not have enough renewable energy available to deal with all our needs. So it is something that probably requires also some measures that some people will see as rather intrusive. And we see that also, when the Commission come with proposals, and then we see, but is it not in a way dealing with things that the Commission shouldn't necessarily deal with because it's better left to others? Yes, if we could make sure that those others are going to do it, but I don't think we can always be sure of that. And therefore, maybe it's the safest bet to have some clear European rules also in this area. And that's probably what we're going to propose now on the 14th of July.
Great, thanks, Hans. Lasse, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah. I want to obviously show my gratitude to Christoph, Natalie, and Hans for some great inputs, which I can use in my political life and work here in Aalborg. But I totally agree with Hans' point that we need this not only to be an engineering too technical discussion. This one of the things I advocated for when I was firstly elected in 2014 was to establish something we call green agents, where local citizens in their neighborhoods can make small green projects that have a greater impact. Because it cannot only be a top-down approach. We need this also to be a bottom-up, where we engage the civil society. And I totally agree with Natalie's points you put in the chat to us that there is a smart school. What we're working on now is a sustainability-specific school path you can take from you're 6 years old until you graduate. And it's both for academia and also for skilled labor. You don't need to be academic in order to follow this school path. Because the future generation needs to be involved and needs to think these discussions are sexy and not only boring and too technical. And I think we as politicians especially have a big impact on making this more, eye to eye with citizens.
Thanks, Lasse. That's a great program you have going there in Aalborg. And Hans already mentioned awareness raising, but obviously education is also key here. We now have 1 minute left for closing comments and remarks. Anyone would like to raise some final issues? Yes, Natalie, go ahead, please.
Maybe just one. So this is on the engagement of the consumers. This is, I would call it intra-generational effort. So it is not only our generation that will determine the course, but I think this engagement already starting from the school level in the design, development, opinion making, and also setting the tone, I think is very important, just to keep it in mind.
Thank you, and I think that's a great optimistic note to end on. A great thank you to our 4 speakers. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you will be able to also tune into some of the other future city sessions. Thank you, and bye-bye.